Hello. I'd like to talk to you about a new concept, a new approach to transport in the urban environment. I'll begin my speech now. Ladies and gentlemen, we all know that cities are growing. Urbanization is a constant factor and has been since the dawn of the industrial age in the 19th century. Various predictions say that by the middle of this century, over half the world's population will be living in an urban environment, if they're not already. That brings huge problems. Obviously, there's the housing aspect of it, but there's also the question of transport. How do we move so many people around the urban environment? There's also, within that concept of transport, of course, there is the problem or the aspect of environmental pollution. We've heard a lot about that recently with emissions from vehicles, but I don't really want to talk about that now. I'd like to talk more about transport from the point of view of congestion. If you live in a major city, you will experience congestion, I'm sure, at least twice a day in the rush hour, in the morning and the evening. But in certain cities around the world, congestion is already a huge factor in people's lives. And even in Los Angeles, a city that was designed and built around the car, a study in 2017 concluded that the average Angelino spent over 100 hours every year sitting stationary in traffic. That's a huge waste. It's a huge waste of time, of lifetime. It's a huge waste of money. The costs to the economy are incalculable. But it's also a waste of resources. If we look at the average car, for example, it stands still for something like 80% of its lifetime. That's a terrible waste of resources. There's also a terrible waste of resources in the infrastructure that is needed to move those cars around. I'm sure you've seen pictures of Los Angeles with 4-lane, 5-lane highways. And those are, for hours a day, completely stationary, but completely stationary, packed full of cars. But also for many hours a day, in the early morning, for example, at 4 a.m., they're completely empty and unused. That's a terrible waste as well. So the economic arguments for finding more efficient ways of transportation are undeniable. And there is also the question that as I said, the return on the investment in all of that infrastructure and all of those vehicles is terrible. And some various calculations have been done about the way the actual cost of infrastructure and of what it costs to really move people around with a car. The average driver thinks that perhaps they'll spend $1. For example, a journey costs them, the driver, $1. But the calculation has been done that says that for that driver to spend $1, it costs society as a whole $9.20 in terms of the infrastructure needed for the car, the roads, but also the subsidies that are paid to the car industry in various forms, the health costs caused by the emissions, by accident insurance, and so on and so forth. Many drivers think that it's cheaper to use a car rather than to take the bus. But if you look at it from a society point of view, it's much more expensive. Using the same calculation basis, $1 on the bus, the cost to the passenger, is a cost to society of $1.50 in terms of the maintenance of the bus, the provision, the payment of the bus driver, etc. And if you then shift the calculation to the use of a bicycle, the $1 that the bicycle rider thinks it costs them is actually a cost to society of 1 cent because of the health benefits. So it's actually a positive contribution to society to use a bicycle. However, those arguments aren't really very powerful to the average citizen, it seems. If we used only economic arguments, then nobody would ever use a car. The factor that weighs in favour of people using private cars is, of course, the freedom that they have. They can get into a car and drive where they want to, when they want to. And so the approach, and that's particularly true in Los Angeles, by the way, where the car is really a symbol of freedom. And so there's been a proposal to change the approach, that in cities like Los Angeles, there needs to be a different approach, not an economic approach, but one that is based on the concept of transport happiness. And it's been shown, and I'm sure if you ride a bicycle to work, you will know that riding a bike to work through a park or through a pleasant environment is a much more enjoyable experience for you personally than simply than sitting in a traffic jam somewhere. And the concept that has been proposed for the city of Los Angeles is a way of measuring that happiness, of making people aware that public transport can contribute positively to their quality of life. And the concept that has been proposed has been called a mobility bill of rights. And that mobility bill of rights consists of 5 freedoms. They are, firstly, briefly, the freedom to get around, freedom from disruption, freedom from harm, freedom to connect, and freedom from exclusion. The 5 freedoms, then, to look at them in more detail, the first one is the freedom to get around. That is fairly self-explanatory. People must have the feeling that public transport takes them where they want to go, when they want to go. The freedom from disruption is not only reliability of the service, but also the ability or the disruption in people's days, people in their daily routine. They must have the feeling that the transport takes them where they want to go, when they want to go, and reliably. Freedom from harm is something that is, particularly in these days, is increased awareness of sexual harassment, is something that's worth considering. And that is the fact that people must have the feeling that they can go on public transport without running the risk of being harassed sexually, racially, or in any other way. The fourth point was the freedom to connect. And that is the social concept, or the social aspect of public transport, that when we're on a bus or on a train, we have the freedom to meet our neighbours, our fellow travellers. There is a social aspect to public transport that isn't present when we all sit in our little tin boxes of cars. And finally, there is, as I said, the freedom from exclusion. And that must be that people are aware that public transport gives them the chance to move around their environment, their city, regardless of their income, regardless of any disabilities that they may have, and regardless of their social status. Particularly in the Western world, the automobile is such a symbol of status, social status, that people feel excluded when they don't have a big, fat, expensive car. With public transport, we're all the same. We can all move at the same speed, in the same comfort. And I found this concept of the Mobility Bill of Rights very interesting, and I think it's something that the future we should consider in all cities in the future, that transport should become a concept of a right and of a freedom of the city, of the inhabitants of the city. Thank you very much.